10 minutes over on Channel 4, a film about musician Punch Miller's performance in a New Orleans jazz festival in 1971. Jazz on 4 on Channel 4 at 11:15. This is London Weekend Television from the South Bank. Now, the London Programme.
All over London, new pirate radio stations are springing up, in open defiance of the law. Do they herald a major revolution in London's radio? These two men are radio pirates. Between them, they're carrying everything they need to broadcast programs across the capital. Today, these pirates, Dave and Jerry, have chosen this tower block in Islington to transmit from. They're going to take the lift to the top floor and force their way onto the roof. Once up here, they'll start to assemble their equipment. It'll only take a few minutes. The programme, a mixture of music, discussion and news, has been pre-recorded and will go out through a cheap cassette player. This will be plugged into a transmitter weighing only a few pounds, and the transmitter will be connected to an aerial strapped, in this case, to a convenient TV pole. The whole rig, as it's called, costs less than £150. It gives a signal stronger. From this depot in Chigwell, British Telecom send out detector vans to track down illegal radio operators like Dave and Jerry. Inside the detector van, a British Telecom engineer tries to pinpoint the source of illegal broadcasts. But despite these efforts, the number of radio pirates is growing rapidly. Across the capital, there are now more than 20 stations on the air, mostly at the weekends. Some of the stations bear names such as Radio Alpha, Radio Phoenix, Radio Free London, Telstar and Horizon. Other pirates are known by initials, JFM, LMR and DBC, imitating typical American music stations. Alice's Restaurant is a heavy rock station. All of them are breaking the 1949 Wireless Telegraphy Act. There's a cat and mouse game going on between the pirates and the authorities. The British Telecom vans rarely catch any pirate in the act of broadcasting. So far this year, no London pirate has been successfully brought to court. Usually all the engineers find are the small transmitters left unattended on tower block roofs. Although this equipment gets confiscated, the pirates invariably have spare transmitters standing by, and they're often back on the air before the vans have returned to base. These council flats in Mitcham, Surrey, are used as a base by Radio Invicta. Invicta's one of the most established of the pirates. Steve Devonne works as a disc jockey at the station. He dreams of a full-time career in radio.
I'm sure at heart we all love to be broadcasters. We'd all love to do this job full-time and get paid for it and earn a decent living and concentrate our lives 100% to being better than what we are at the moment. But unfortunately, it's not possible, as the law stands.
Guys and girls, the greatest thing to hit London for years.
The time is 2 minutes to 12 o'clock, and you're listening to Radio Invicta on 92.4. Coming up at the top of the hour, the man himself.
In the studio, Tony Johns is just finishing his 2-hour stint. Radio Invicta has been very much his baby from the start.
The station's taken over in a way from our own personal lives, because whereas it used to be a hobby and a pastime that we all enjoyed, we still enjoyed doing it, but now it's become an entity in its own rights. It would be unfair for our listeners if we just ceased to broadcast.
Devonne is due to take over the midday spot. Radio Invicta is in fact a shoestring affair. It broadcasts only on Sundays and is run by a team of volunteer, unpaid DJs. It carries very little advertising and has no serious financial backing. Yet despite its modest scale, Radio Invicta appears to be meeting a need. It seems to have revealed a gap in the market that isn't filled by legal radio, whether BBC or independent.
Bring you the best in soul, funk and jazz, as we always do. If we're allowed to, that is.
It specialises in soul music, and its 14 hours of soul on Sunday appears to have brought it a regular audience.
Jim Colvin, Andy Jackson, and of course...
The presentation's professional, and for an illegal station, it's well equipped.
Of 4 and 6.
It's gone one step ahead of most pirates by actually broadcasting live to its audience.
Uppers and downers, rises and droppers.
It's regularly listed as a top soul station by specialist magazines.
And of course, don't forget to give us a ring. Phone the telephone number, which is 870-3322. I'll repeat that, 870-3322.
Phone-ins and dedications help pull in the listeners.
Records of the day. And with that information, we can compile London's most listened to charts. The Radio Invicta Soul Poll, 92.4.
We've estimated that we have upwards of 50,000 listeners. And from all walks of life, the listeners, but mainly the youngsters that will buy records and listen to them in clubs and then want to know where they can buy them, because we deal largely in American imports, as the soul fans want to hear sounds ahead of everybody else. They want to hear them first, and we try to bring them first.
But soul enthusiasts are not the only ones unhappy with the present system. There's another pirate station which is also in business because the authorised radio stations are not seen as meeting the needs of listeners. Here in Ladbroke Grove, reggae's big business. Many of the records on sale here will have been heard first on the local pirate station, DBC. The record store manager's Martin Trenchfield.
God, this is a local place for them, you know, and DBC is really known around this area very strong. But it's not just in this area, it's all over Brixton, Balham, Crickwood, Halsden, you know. So it's wider variety and they play wider reggae music, so.
DBC, or to give it its full title, the Dread Broadcasting Corporation, was set up 18 months ago by Leroy Anderson and some friends who still help out. Anderson had no previous experience of radio. He began broadcasting from his back garden in Neasden using a 10-foot pole.
Well, I got started because, first of all, Sundays was boring on TV and on radio. And secondly, I'd lived in New York for a year, and I'd taken in New York radio. And I thought, why not here? For going on Sundays, we got the BBC with a reggae program on Sunday. And we thought we'd continue it. After it finished, we'd carry on, you know, at first.
Style. 4-5.
Since then, the station's gone up in the world. It now has its own studio in Kilburn and goes out every Friday night. The style is unmistakable.
Interviewed by my sister Rankin Speak, coming up right now on the station. Identification style, this one, so just say.
The technical quality is uneven, and the phone-in arrangements are a little unconventional.
Yeah, we've got our own phone in as well. Every Friday we give out a phone number. And we rush to the phone box, a local phone box in the area. Rush down to the phone box and, of course, just pour in. You know, sometimes you've got to get to the phone box and say the lift breaks down and you're at the top of the block. You know, you have to leg it down the stairs and go away to the phone box. It's quite exciting stuff.
This track called Love of a Woman, era.
But with all its limitations, DBC has an established following. There's a steady flow of letters, and it now gets regular coverage in the music press. Anderson thinks this all points to a real failing on the part of the legal music stations.
We've got an hour's programme like the BBC or IBA to say we've got an hour's programme here or 2 hours there. But that's rubbish, you know what I mean? What's 2 hours? You know what I mean? Because we feel there's a real need for more black music on the air, you know. not enough airplay for black music, reggae particularly.
Radio pirates like Leroy Anderson argue that the big broadcasting institutions like the BBC here in Portland Place are out of touch. And they say that even the newer independent stations like Capital don't provide the range of music Londoners want. It was just this kind of argument, in fact, which gave rise to the first wave of radio piracy 20 years ago. At that time, the BBC still enjoyed a monopoly of all radio broadcasting, which had been granted by charter in 1922. The assumption then was that BBC Radio could, on its own, cater for all tastes.
Time for Housewife's Choice, introduced by Richard Murdoch.
Housewife's Choice, presented by people like Richard Murdoch, had a broad appeal, but not to young people. Their tastes were largely ignored.
Good morning, ladies. Our first request this morning is from Mrs. Ada Spillington, Oak Lodge, Crawley, Sussex, for her daughter Ellen. She says you'd like some jolly music to help you start the day, so what about this?
I think it's very hard for young people, particularly, to imagine what radio was like before the pirates came along in the 60s. Pop music was relegated to the weekend. You had 2 hours on a Saturday, Brian Matthews' famous Saturday Club, which had Bert Weedon doing his instrumental versions of the hits, and then Easy Beat on a Sunday morning. And that was it. That was it.
Tune to Radio Caroline on 199.
Can't buy me love.
Then in 1964, a radio station set up in an old freighter moored off the Essex coast started transmitting a very different kind of music. Anchored just outside the 3-mile limit, Radio Caroline transformed the music scene overnight. Caroline's formula was simple: pop music round the clock. Within a few weeks, it had several million young listeners.
Easter Sunday 1964, Radio Caroline came on the air, and suddenly, wham, you know, all day long, pop records. And the young people couldn't believe it. I mean, it was like a mecca, going down to Clacton and transistor radios were just coming in. That was another part of the revolution, was little radios in boxes. They would go down on the beach and be able to see the ship out on the horizon with the big mast sticking up there and listen in. And it was just a lovely feeling of freedom.
And indeed, without a change in the law, there was nothing the government could do directly about Radio Caroline or any of the other pirates that set up. Being in international waters, the pirate ships were outside British jurisdiction. The Labour government of the day, with a small majority, was unwilling to risk the unpopularity of a decisive move against the pirates until there was some other outlet for pop music. But then in 1967, the BBC set up its own pop station, Radio 1. Almost immediately, the Marine Offences Act was introduced, making it illegal for anyone to advertise with the pirates. The Labour minister, Tony Benn, who steered the bill through Parliament, was confident that this meant the end of them.
I can't peer into a crystal ball, but I can say this, that this government, and I believe any government, would enforce existing law, would carry legislation through, and that the pirate radio ships have no future at all. I'm quite convinced of that. And I think the sooner they're convinced of it, the better.
The offshore radio pirates were in due course sunk. They were unable to compete with the coming of legal commercial radio in the 70s. But during their time, the pirates had changed the face of popular radio. Capital Radio was the station that became London's legal popular music station when the Tory government granted franchises in 1973.
And it's 9 minutes to 1. Happy birthday to Valerie, who comes from Croydon in Surrey. Happy 21st, Valerie. Here's Frida from her new album, Just For You, okay?
Today, Capital Radio stands accused by the pirates of what is a new version of the old complaint against the BBC. The charge now is not that pop music's being ignored, it's that specialist pop music is relegated to inadequate off-peak slots. The musical taste of minorities, whether soul or reggae, is unsatisfied. Brian Morgan is Deputy Managing Director of Capital.
The Afro-Caribbean musical scene is extremely wide, very complex and very interesting. We do have programs designed to try and meet that need, David Rodigan, which is a very popular program amongst those communities. Obviously, though, they would like that music more of the time. It's a question of balance. It's difficult to give a more precise answer than that because the schedules vary from time to time. We add small features in. What you have to try and avoid is having a program which is so specialized and so polarized that the general listener will say, that's not for me, and switch off and go elsewhere.
In choosing music for its programmes, Capital Radio has to rely a lot on music that will appeal to a majority of its 4 million listeners. For Capital, there's a difficult balancing act to perform in meeting its obligations under the franchise granted to it by the Independent Broadcasting Authority to provide general entertainment. It's a real problem catering for London's minorities.
The difficulty really is that London is so many minorities. Now, if we decided to have reggae on Monday, gay programming on Tuesday, and other minority on Wednesday, it would, first of all, it would alienate all the listeners other than those who are particularly interested in that particular activity. It would also mean that they themselves would get very little airtime because it would come up, or their turn would come up, perhaps once a month, once every 2 months. And I don't think that really is the best way of providing the service. What we seek to do is to meet their needs, hopefully within our general programming.
Serving minorities may not be easy when radio stations are in short supply, but it's not like this in the case of other comparable cities. Disc jockey Johnny Walker has worked in a city which he claims has the sort of radio setup that satisfies the needs of minorities, at least as far as music's concerned.
I spent 6 years in San Francisco, which is a population of half of the London area, and there's 50 radio stations. Any kind of music you want, and there's a radio station providing it. So you can have hard rock, head-banging stuff, soft rock, Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, Carole King, that kind of thing, classical music, Valium, elevator, lift music, you know, instrumentals, that kind of thing, 24-hour news, talk stations, and anything you want. If you can find an audience and sell some advertising, you can stay on the air. It's as simple as that. And it's a free market approach, and it works.
Any changes in the broadcasting rules which might bring the London scene close to a San Francisco free-for-all would have to be drafted here at the Home Office. Until recently, there wasn't much hope of this happening because the Home Office had always resisted a free market in radio and television. But there's now an indication that this might change. Last month, a committee chaired by Lord Hunt produced this report on cable television. Although the Hunt report didn't come out entirely in favour of a free market in TV, it did recommend the creation of 30 new cable TV channels. When these are in operation, we'll be much nearer a broadcasting free-for-all than ever before in this country. And some broadcasting specialists believe that this breakdown of the TV monopoly could soon spread to radio.
With the development of cable TV, I think there's going to be an increasing contradiction between tight control of the airwaves, or the radio airwaves, and quite a free, unregulated situation for television. And this must make it much easier to argue for new developments in the field of radio. I think it would be very difficult for the Home Office bureaucrats to argue that in actual fact we could have unregulated TV and not some loosening of the regime as regards radio itself.
A change in the ideological climate brought about by Hunt is coinciding with a new appraisal of the technical possibilities for increasing the number of radio stations, particularly on the VHF waveband. The VHF waveband runs from 88 to 108 megahertz, but at present only the lower half is used for public radio. Many pirates broadcast in frequencies between the legal stations, using low-power transmitters. And some radio engineers claim that the potential of transmitting in this way has been ignored.
I think that no one has really seriously investigated these possibilities because that's not what the broadcasters were looking for. So when the Home Office draw up frequency plans, they work on the basis of what the BBC and the IBA want. No one has actually come along to them and said, draw up a plan including some low-power radio stations. Because if they did, they would discover that it was perfectly technically possible.
In addition, there's a band between 102 and 104 megahertz which is allocated for radio but not currently used. New independent local stations are expected to go in this space, but none is planned for London. Norman MacLeod believes this represents a major opportunity for the London area.
At the moment there's 2 megahertz of spectrum which is sitting doing nothing between 102 and 104 megahertz. That could be used for something like a London-wide access station, plus a number of smaller stations. When you get into counting up how many smaller stations you can have in a given bit of spectrum, it entirely depends on how big you want the smaller stations to be. You might be able to have 4 or 5 stations in a quadrant round the city, or you could have as many as 30 stations, each serving a small borough.
Norman MacLeod's view is not as yet shared by the Home Office, but he's supported by an internal BBC study on London broadcasting produced in 1978. It said,
"The best advice we could get suggests that 5 or 6 frequencies would be available for new all-London stations. Alternatively, some 25 much smaller stations, covering a few kilometres each, would be able to go on the air."
What's more, the upper end of the VHF waveband, which is presently used by the police and other emergency services, is going to be handed over for radio broadcasting, possibly as early as 1986. Christopher Chataway, the minister responsible for the launch of independent local radio in the 70s, is convinced that the new political climate, plus space in the wavebands, heralds a new era.
I think that we are moving into now a completely new situation. The justification for strict control of broadcasting has basically always been a shortage of frequencies, and it was perfectly fair that so long as there were a shortage of frequencies, first for radio and then for television, that you should have public bodies very strictly controlling the use of satellites, and with cable we seem to be entering into an era when there will be no shortage whatsoever. So then people have to ask, well, why should there be a control over the use of those frequencies that there isn't in the case of the print medium? You don't have any authority deciding what has to go into a newspaper or a magazine. And I think it is reasonable to look, therefore, towards a time when there will be no control, much less control, over both radio and television.
Yeah, we bring you all the soul hits and more, and we'd like to have some petition forms filled in by our listeners out there and sent back into us so that we can perhaps try and become legal like everybody else, okay?
With the prospects of a coming era of broadcasting freedom, it's understandable that even the pirates like Radio Invicta are hopeful that before long Londoners will be able to listen to the station legally. But the radio pirates like Invicta are not the only groups in London hoping to be allowed to transmit legitimately. Peter Lewis is a leading figure in a campaign for what's called community radio. He's also concerned about minority audiences.
Well, if you look around some of the other countries, North America, Australia, what's being proposed in France, what you see is a sort of radio that reaches other audiences that the mainstream services can't reach, i.e. audiences that don't constitute a commercial market or that have been neglected by the state system. And a very common characteristic of this kind of service, these kinds of stations, is a very much closer relationship with the audience than you have in broadcasting, even in mainstream local radio.
There's a radio studio at Goldsmiths College where Peter Lewis teaches, which he believes could provide the facilities for a community radio station around the New Cross area.
I think we could imagine a variety of stations, some perhaps arising out of a college like this, which would start with a core of educational programming and mix it with rock music and an appeal to young people.
I think there's something wrong with the mic. Oh, doesn't it come through? No.
Another sort of station might be based on a ethnic population in a particular locality, or you might decide in a city like London or Birmingham or Liverpool that the ethnic population was large enough to justify a city-wide station. Paris, for instance, there has been just licensed a station for gay people. One might imagine a young person station.
Judith, can you give us a voice level again, please?
Good afternoon. This afternoon we're going to be discussing...
The thinking behind community radio is in some accord with the independent broadcasting authorities' concern that local interests get a fair hearing, and with the government's inclination to less regulation over broadcasting. It has some distinctive features.
Possibly the most important one is the idea of listeners and ordinary people actively participating in making programmes, in running the stations and organising them. And not just that they should be invited in occasionally into the studios, but actively enabled to learn how to express themselves and get themselves over on the air. Maybe there's some other important distinctions, like the fact they shouldn't be set up purely to make money, that there should be some sort of democratic control of the way the station's policy is worked out.
It was the Annan Committee report on the future of broadcasting, published in 1977, that really gave respectability to the concept of community radio, and which accounts for the high expectations to this day that the government will take action to set it up. Philip Whitehead, a Labour MP, was a member of the committee.
We wanted a new force in broadcasting, which was essentially starting at the grassroots, starting in the locality. It wasn't going to be a question of how a national system should be organised so as, on the one hand, to preserve the BBC's monopoly of public service radio, on the other hand, a certain number of lucrative and profitable entities for the big organisations who run ILR. In the middle, there ought to have been a positive desire to sustain and increase the local community element.
It was community radio overseas that encouraged the Annan Committee to think that it could happen here. In Australia, there are stations which broadcast in up to 40 languages to make immigrants feel more at home. This could be a model well suited to London's ethnic minorities. It won't perhaps come as any surprise that the GLC's got in on the act. Last month, it sponsored a conference here at County Hall to discuss the future of London radio. There were many speakers urging that London listeners should have available to them a much greater variety of stations, run by groups such as feminists and gays. One speaker above all made an impact on the conference. Indeed, it wouldn't be going too far to say he electrified it. He was a man from the Home Office, a civil servant called Robert Hazel. He's the official with the responsibility to draw up proposals for the Home Secretary on how community radio might be developed. He made a rather careful statement, which has nonetheless been seized on by the community lobby as a portent of great change coming soon. This is what he said.
We have not taken this forward as quickly as we would have wished, and this is not because of any lack of interest in community radio. Quite the reverse. We are genuinely interested.
Peter Lewis is convinced the Home Office is now beginning to change its attitude to community radio.
If we held meetings and conferences about community radio, if the Home Office came at all, they'd keep very silent. But what we're getting now is just a more informed interest, and certainly remarks being made, for instance, the effect that it's not a matter of if community radio, but when, and that we've made a convincing case.
Lewis now believes that the Home Office will in the very near future issue up to 6 experimental licences to try the idea out in practice. 3 of these could be in London. And some of the pirates have come together to make a joint application for a licence. DBC is one of them. They believe they could run a station for young blacks, who have at the moment little radio specifically designed for them.
Okay. Now tuning to the interview styling, Miss P and Man Errol for DBC exclusively. Text away, Miss P. Come in.
Their programming includes interviews with leading black artists. Errol Dunkley is a top reggae star.
I've been in the business now for over 18 years, more than half my lifetime, you know.
DBC believes there would be a demand for a black community radio station.
We'd like to see a black station pretty soon. We think there's a need for it, very much, you know. The same as in the States, New York City, you go there, you got stations galore, you know, and there's no harm done. Everybody's happy.
Before we go in, I'd like to introduce...
So there's some hope then among groups of London's minorities in either musical taste or ethnic background that they may soon be allowed free and legitimate access to the airwaves. But how likely is it that they'll get what they want? We've seen that there are openings in the wave bands and a new political thinking towards broadcasting that could work in their favour. There are, however, other problems. These could be the decisive factors in the shape of London radio to come. The existing broadcasters have their own territory to protect, the BBC for instance. On the face of it, the BBC's position about an all-black station appears not to be unsympathetic.
There are, in London, so many different communities that I think that it would be desirable to have community stations, low-power community stations, which serve particular sections of the community rather than try and attempt to take on the whole. It is certainly not for the BBC, and I can speak quite openly on this, it is certainly not for the BBC to stand in the way of that kind of development, and I'm quite sure we should welcome it.
Although Michael Barton is in favour of community radio, in the past the corporation's actual behaviour has been unhelpful. Politicians believe that the BBC blocked the Annan Committee's key proposal for community radio.
What happened was graphically described by Roy Hattersley, the Shadow Home Secretary, when this matter was discussed recently in Edinburgh. And I asked him why the then Labour government didn't introduce all of the parts of the Annan package. And he said, quite simple, we were whitewashed by the BBC. And it's undoubtedly the case that at that moment, the BBC, very nervous of losing its stake in local radio, as it saw, because it wants to be in every form of broadcasting in Britain, mounted a tremendous exercise against the proposal, and that pushed the government over.
The BBC's support for or opposition to community radio could be critical. This document shows that in its forward planning, the BBC doesn't see much room for it in this country. The length of the VHF waveband available for radio is due to double in the next few years, but the BBC plan to take more space on the waveband by changing their existing station signals and by setting up new channels. There'll be no more room for outsiders than there is at the moment. If these BBC plans were to be accepted, radio newcomers would have little chance. But it's not